One.
Great, thank you. So I'm Trent Home. Thank you for coming this evening. I'm a number of different things, but what brings me here this evening is the fact that I write about U.S. Navy history, uh, particularly the evolution of the U.S. Navy's tactics and doctrine in the first half of the 20th century, or roughly the time period between the Spanish-American War and the end of World War II. And I was invited tonight to talk about some of those ideas, particularly from the perspective of how did wargaming influence the United States Navy's evolution of tactics and doctrine. I'm going to focus on time period roughly about between 1906 and 1941. I'll blur things a little bit on either end of that. And I do not do this full time. This is a passionate interest of mine, but my full time job is working at a consultant in a company called ICF International, which is based in Reston, Virginia. And one of the things that's been very nice about that work is some of the things that I do in consulting and working with clients, a large number of which are within the federal government, is I've found overlaps between the work that I do particularly from an IT point of view. I work a lot in technology and some of the approaches or techniques that the United States Navy was employing during this time period, roughly a century ago. So it's nice to see how there are themes from history that have some relevance today. And if there are questions about that, I can cover some of those things toward the end. But what I want to focus on now is the work of the United States Navy. Now, I
Trent, just before you go on, I think some people may be having a little hard time hearing you. You mind maybe turning up your mic volume or moving it a little closer? Thank you.
Um, I have changed things a little bit. Is that better?
That's perfect. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Good. Thank you for making me aware of that. All right. I'll not spend too much time rehashing the introduction, but if people are having trouble hearing, I am a historian of the United States Navy, particularly from the window into its tactics, doctrine, leadership, strategy, and I find some synergies between that and my day job as a consultant. So I think that's kind of relevant. I've written extensively on these topics, and some of the things that I'm going to build off of are contained in my book that was published in 2018 by the Naval Institute, Learning War, which talks about the evolution of the U.S. Navy's tactics and doctrine, particularly from a surface warfare perspective. And one of the things that I think is interesting, and why I'm very happy to talk to this group this evening, is when people ask me, well, how did you get into that? How did you start the work or the research that led to publishing that book? And a lot of it has its roots in my interest in wargaming. I used to play a lot of naval war games. And in some of the internet forums back in the early days of the internet, back in the 1990s, that I would frequent, occasionally a question would come up. And that question was, suppose the attack on Pearl Harbor had not happened. Suppose the battle line of the United States Navy had not been destroyed in that attack. How would the U.S. Navy have fought a fleet action in the Central Pacific against the forces of Imperial Japan? And what I thought was so interesting about that question is no one had a really good answer to it. There were lots of hypotheses, theories, capabilities of various ship classes and types, but no definitive, well, no, this is how the U.S. Navy would have fought, and this is what it would have done, and this is how a battle like that, if it unfolded the way that the U.S. Navy expected, would have happened. And I thought, wow, nobody knows. Maybe I should try to figure that out. And it was one of those, you start pulling on the thread and then you start to see how deep the rabbit hole goes. And so it's 20 some years later, I was able to package up the research that I had done and put it into a book. And one of the themes of that book, one of the themes of learning war, is that I believe the Navy became a learning organization in this time period. There were some nascent elements of that before the U.S. entry into World War I in 1917, but it really became much more systematized, systematic in the time period between the two world wars, what we typically call the interwar period. And wargaming was a key aspect of that process. It was one of the influences on U.S. naval officers and others that allowed the U.S. Navy to learn and to do so in a disciplined and structured way. So there are a couple pieces to the talk tonight that will get into how that happened and some of the influences between tactics, doctrine, and wargaming. And I'll start first with a look at the emergence of doctrine in the United States Navy. Because one of the things that I went looking for when I was trying to figure out, well, how would the Navy have fought in 1941 or early 1942 had Pearl Harbor not occurred, is I thought it would be simple enough, to find the right kind of manual that would prescribe a doctrine. This is what forces have, right? They have fighting instructions, they have doctrinal manuals. Look at those, and that will tell me what they were anticipating to do. But the Navy thought of doctrine in slightly different ways a century ago than we do today, a little bit less prescriptive and a little bit more flexible. And so I think it's important to ground this conversation in that concept and explain how doctrine, as the Navy thought of it, began to emerge. So I start with principles of war. The Navy was caught up in and part of an increasing wave of professionalism in the mid to late 19th century. Within the United States, we were defining what it meant to be a professional doctor or a professional scientist. There were rules to these professions that started to emerge. There were societies that defined those rules, defined what it meant to be part of that profession or a professional. And one of the U.S. naval officers is most closely associated with this work is Alfred Thayer Mahan. I'm sure many of you will recognize him. And Mahan felt that there were principles of war. There was a grounding that could be discerned that would be required to understand and to be able to apply if you were going to be a professional naval officer. So Mahan and others like Stephen B. Luce agitated for an institution where these principles could be elucidated and understood, and where officers could come and look at historically how these principles had been applied. Because one of the things that was very important to Mahan was, yes, there are principles. The principle of surprise, or a principle of security, a principle of the offensive. But you can tell just from their names, their general concepts. You have to have knowledge of how they might be applied. You have to understand how they had been applied historically, and then you have to develop an artistic sensibility of how you might apply them to a future context. And I use that terminology, artistic sensibility, deliberately. I borrowed it from John Sumita's study of Alfred Thayer Mahan. And one of the things that Sumita argues is that what Mahan was trying to do was to encourage U.S. naval officers to develop a capability, have this deep grounding of history so that they could know how these principles had been applied in past conflicts, and they could use that knowledge and to help inform them as to how to apply those same principles in future conflicts. So there's this dynamic capability that Mahan is arguing for. And he does this at the Naval War College. He serves as its president there, and he begins to turn the curriculum toward this perspective that he has, grounding the work of officers and their increasing professionalism in historical study. In the 1890s, Henry Clay Taylor becomes president of the Naval War College, and he brings the idea of wargaming to the institution because Taylor thinks that this historical study is valuable and important, but it can be augmented. It's not all that we need to do. We also need to test our ability to apply these principles to contexts against each other. So let's have competition. Let's have war games. Let's explore how these principles might apply to future naval conflicts. Now, the rules that are developed at this time to govern the war games that are introduced at the Naval War College are not terribly sophisticated. They're relatively simplistic, but they do allow what Taylor desires, which is an ability for officers to test against each other how they might apply these concepts on a game board. They also begin to influence how the U.S. Navy thinks about tactics, how it might fight a modern fleet. And one of the things that is produced through the work at the Naval War College is something called Battle Plan Number 1. And Battle Plan Number 1, when I first saw it, I thought, wow, this is very basic. This is very rudimentary, because all it really is a plan of maneuver. At this time, the U.S. Navy is relatively small. We're talking about 1906. European navies are larger, certainly the largest ones of like Great Britain or Germany or France. And so also U.S. Navy battleships tend to be a little bit smaller and often slower than some of their potential opponents. And so what Battle Plan Number 1 is designed to do is to mitigate this. Basically what it is we will maneuver our line of battleships such that the head of our line, whichever battleship is in the front of the U.S. line, the van, is going to turn gradually such that it keeps the leading ship of the opponent battle line at a 90-degree bearing, on the broadside. And so if we are faced with a faster opponent, we will turn inside them, and this will prevent them from turning our flank and securing an advantageous position where they could cross the T or something similar. And this emerges out of the wargaming, the tactical wargaming that's going on at this time at the Naval War College. So it is a theoretical concept that seems to work well, at least in the trials that are done at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. But it's difficult to test it in the fleet because at this time, the U.S. Navy is distributed. There are a large number of squadrons and stations around the world, and each of those has a couple of ships. And so to bring a large number of ships together, more than 5, say, to practice maneuvers and to learn how to handle a modern fleet in battle is practically impossible. But that changes very quickly because President Theodore Roosevelt brings together all the modern battleships of the fleet and forms them into the Atlantic Fleet, or also the Great White Fleet, because of the buff color of the hulls that you can get a sense of from this picture. Now, soon after forming it, Roosevelt sends it around the world on the cruise of the Great White Fleet. But on that cruise, and then after the fleet returns to the East Coast, it conducts experiments. It tries maneuvers. So for the first time, the U.S. Navy has the ability now to put a modern fleet together, to begin to understand how could we best maneuver these different ships? How can we coordinate them at sea? So things like Battle Plan Number 1 are trialed, and it seems to be fairly logical and effective. But as I mentioned, it's very simple. So it's not really an effective plan of battle. More, it's here's how we think we might best maneuver the battleships if we happen to fight, and if we're going to have a fight, battle lines. The Navy has to spend some time gaining familiarity with just how to maneuver together before it can think about more sophisticated tactics. And that starts to happen around about 1912 or 1913, because by that time, Rear Admiral Charles Badger is commanding the Atlantic Fleet. And Badger has a neat idea. What Badger wants to do is he wants to take the rules that have been used to govern wargaming at the Naval War College and use them as a tool within the fleet. So Badger will use wargaming to explore what is theoretically possible, to get his officers to explore new tactics, new way to coordinate the movement of ships, familiarize them with the potential that they have on the game board. And then we will use that theoretical understanding and we'll take it into maneuvers. And so we'll calibrate what is theoretically possible and refine it with what is practically feasible, with what actually works in maneuvers at sea. And so Badger is increasing the sophistication of what the Navy can do with its newest fleet, and using this dual tool of war games, which can be executed in wardrooms, with maneuvers and exercises performed at sea to try to refine tactics and an understanding of how best to handle a modern fleet in battle. This is important because at this time, additional platforms, types of ships are joining the fleet, and it's important for Badger and his subordinates to understand how to work them together. There are battleships now, of course, but they have increased in size since the introduction of the dreadnought type, and also capability. Like cruisers are starting to join the force, and there are, at least in the US Navy, a large number of destroyers that have to be integrated into the fighting force. The destroyers form an important window, and there's a challenge with coordinating all of this, because as you get all these different types together, and as you the range of the battleship guns and other things start to increase the potential size and scope of a major fleet action, it becomes much more difficult to coordinate all these different types in a potential conflict or in a maneuver. There's a lot of smoke. These are coal burning ships, and so it can be difficult to see through that haze or conditions of limited visibility and understand any signaled orders, right? Most of this is still being done by signal flags at the time, so you have to be within sight of any superior ship that is conveying orders. Radio, although it exists, is an unreliable communication mechanism that can easily be jammed by a potential opponent. And so it's difficult to see, and it's difficult to communicate. Now, a younger officer, Dudley Knox, is confronted with this challenge. He's at the Naval War College around this time, and he starts thinking through the problem. And he thinks if the Navy is able to indoctrinate in a positive way subordinate officers, then this is a way to lend cohesion in battle, to create coherence around how the fleet is going to coordinate and how the fleet is going to operate. And so Knox begins to write on this. He talks with other officers of the Naval War College and begins to spread this idea. Look, if we practice in the right ways, if we develop some routines, some habits of mind, we'll be able to, when the time comes, coordinate our activities with a minimal amount of signaling, and we won't have to rely on radio or other technologies that, although they exist and are quite powerful, cannot or should not be relied upon in the confusion and the fast pace of an unfolding naval battle. One of the people who is at the Naval War College, who is hearing these theories from Knox and absorbing them, is William S. Sims. And Sims is offered the opportunity to come to the Atlantic Fleet and to take command of the torpedo flotilla that is there. This is where the destroyers, or torpedo boats as they were known before they got large enough, are placed within the Atlantic Fleet. Now, Sims has a few criteria that he wants to see met before he's willing to come and command the flotilla. And the most important of these is he wants to bring a staff with him. Now, for most of you in the audience, I'm sure you're thinking, well, sure, yeah, he'd have a staff. He's commanding a flotilla. He needs a staff. But prior to Sims, the commander of the flotilla had not had a staff. So this is a new thing. Sims is asking for some additional capacity, some additional officers who can help him understand how best to apply this concept of doctrine to the flotilla at sea. And so Sims brings Knox with him, as well as some other colleagues from the Naval War College, to his new command. And they use the torpedo flotilla as a laboratory, essentially, to explore how best to make Knox's theories work. And one of the things that they do is what Badger has already introduced to the fleet. they use wargaming. They lay out game boards within Sims's flagship, and they bring the captains of the flotilla together and explore how they might coordinate their actions in an exercise or a mock combat. And through that, they develop a better sense of how to work together, and they start to develop doctrine, or a shared sense of how to act in certain circumstances, the kind of doctrine that Knox is interested in. And it works. It works quite well. The torpedo flotilla under Sims begins to outperform other arms of the fleet because they have a shared sense of how to act together. And this is true not just in the kinds of maneuvers that we'd expect destroyers to perform, that is, torpedo attacks, particularly under the cover of darkness, but also sometimes these ships of the torpedo flotilla are stand-ins for opposing battleships to exercise the fleet in a mock combat between battle lines, the existing Atlantic Fleet battle line, and then a potential hypothetical one played by Sims's destroyers. And so doctrine helps in the kinds of tactics that Sims and his flotilla would employ in actual battle, but also in other ways. And so the fleet begins to see the value in this, and the potential starts to emerge. But what really locks it in is the performance of the U.S. Navy in World War I. So after leading the flotilla, Sims goes on to bring Battleship Nevada into commission. He also serves as president of the Naval War College. But in preparation for the U.S. entry into World War I, he goes to Europe to liaise with European navies, and then assumes command of some of the U.S. naval forces in European waters. And there, he uses this same sort of concept. He tasks his subordinates with formulating the doctrines, create coherent concepts for how you're going to act together, particularly as the U.S. destroyers participate in the fight against German U-boats. And so World War I not only exposes more officers to this concept of doctrine and the potential value of it, it also validates that this is worthwhile. These groups under Sims perform well, and they feel like after the war, this is a practice that we need to codify. And so in the immediate aftermath of the war, there is a U.S. Pacific Fleet, an Atlantic Fleet. Each of them has destroyer formations. Those two groups begin to collaborate to not just codify the lessons from World War I, but also the established best practices for how to handle destroyers. And they do this in collaboration with the Naval War College, where Sims has returned as a president. And this leads to the first official doctrinal manuals of the United States Navy. First, there is destroyer instructions for the Atlantic Fleet, and then there are fighting instructions for the Atlantic Fleet as a whole. And one of the things that I think is very interesting about them is they do not specify how exactly destroyers or other ship types will fight. Instead, they emphasize that doctrine is necessary. Doctrine should be developed, but it is the responsibility of relatively low-level commanders, squadron or division commanders, to develop doctrines for their forces so that they can fight cohesively. And this has two important features. First, it means that doctrine is variable. It can vary from squadron to squadron or division to division. And second, it is contextually sensitive, so it will reflect the fighting capabilities of the ships that are in that organization, as well as the dispositions of the officers that are in it. So these are two very important pieces that the Navy takes into the interwar period. Now, let me see. Well, we've got an awful lot of things in the chat here. Book sales just went up by 1. Great. Now, let me talk a little bit about some of the dynamics of the wargaming before I get into the details of the interwar period, where some of these things worked together to make a more systematic learning environment. I mentioned when I was talking about battle plan number 1 that some of the rules are relatively rudimentary. Also, that battle plan number one emerges from tactical wargaming by 1912, and I'm sure many of you are already familiar with this name, William McCarty Little. You get the introduction of a strategic wargaming concept, or also called the chart maneuver, as you can see here in the photograph of the cover of this pamphlet. And so you get wargaming for tactical situations, the kinds of things that Sims and Badger were using in the Atlantic Fleet, but you also have this concept of a strategic game, so that we will understand not just how individual ships might maneuver around, but how should fleets get handled. And one of the major objectives of this kind of war game is, at least at the Naval War College, how do you formulate plans and orders in a coherent and well-patterned way? Essentially, how do you teach officers how to write well-formed orders so that they don't get misinterpreted, and so that they can easily be taken by subordinate commands and used as a basis for forming the orders to their subordinates? The chart maneuver was a way in which the Navy practiced this. And you've probably heard of something called the estimate of the situation, which was the process whereby officers would take the instructions from higher authority, understand the potential of their own forces, the challenge or the objectives that they've been given, and then use that as a basis to write orders to their subordinate commands. The chart maneuver helped practice this. Yes, the Green Hornet, absolutely. Now, as to the simplistic model, I wanted to show an example of how some of these things manifested. This is from the Asiatic Fleet's maneuver rules of 1923. So in the interwar period, the United States Navy has an Asiatic fleet, and it's got relatively old ships in it. But here you can see in this table, it's interesting. There's a couple of things in here that are relevant. Ships in the Navy's war games had a concept of life. How long could they survive? That's what life means. And so here in these rules, the life of a DD, a destroyer or destroyer minesweeper, is measured in seconds. If it's being fired at by an old armored cruiser, that's what OCA, or an armored cruiser, AC, then under 1,500 yards, you can see 180 seconds or 3 minutes. So if you're a destroyer and you're being fired at by one of these cruiser types, you're going to, at this close range, you'll survive for 3 minutes. And you can't really see it because of the way the slide is structured, but it says farther below, the life of the ship is going to be divided into 3 periods. So, after the first period, so after the first minute in this example, you'll suffer a minor casualty. After the second minute, a major casualty. After the third minute, that's it. The ship is either sunk or rendered incapable of continued combat. And so the life concept here is important, but also you can see this is intended to make it easier for umpires. So when the Asiatic fleet is doing exercises governed by these rules, ships would have umpires on them, and the umpires would be expected to adhere to these maneuver rules and assess damage to the ships that they were on, so that the wargaming could flow in a way that made sense, reflected assumptions about naval combat, and also led to results that could inform the officers that were participating. Now, you'll see with this structure, there are some artificialities. There is no sense of a sort of like a critical or a decisive hit. There's no variability, right? There's no die rolls. There is just, this is the range, this is your life, this is the damage rate at that sort of range band, and that's it. And that's it. Now, later on, some of the maneuver rules do introduce, the ones for maneuvers at sea, do introduce some potential variability, but they're always structured to ensure that umpires can assess what's going on and keep pace with the action. And they always have this sort of linear assumption of the degradation of a ship and its capabilities, which some have criticized. Like, for example, if you're familiar with Wayne Hughes's book Fleet Tactics, Hughes thinks that, or has argued that, the pace of some of these games, particularly the ones played at the Naval War College, were too slow to familiarize U.S. Navy officers with the challenges of combat, and also that these artificialities in terms of the gradual degradation of combat power shaped their thinking in an unfortunate way. But what it does allow, in some respects, is an understanding of these principles that Mahan and other officers are stressing. And it also leads to the introduction of this concept of the N-square law. And I've got Bradley Fisk pictured here because he was a proponent of this idea. Also, he wrote a book published in 1916, The Navy is a Fighting Machine, which has tables in the back that illustrate this law and the concept. And I expect most listeners are familiar with it. But very briefly, it is, your fighting strength is not equal to just a comparison of the two numbers if you have two opposing sides. The fighting strength instead is proportional to the square of the capabilities of those two sides. And this can get translated very easily into like numbers of ships. So for example, if simplistically speaking, if you've got a battle line of 5 battleships, and the opponent has a battle line of 3, the fighting strength ratio is not 5 to 3, it is 25 to 9, apply the squares. And these models begin to influence the thinking of U.S. Navy officers, and that becomes important when we start thinking about arms limitation treaties in the interwar period. Now, some of the concepts of how the Navy thinks about life and how it runs these rules begin to get a little bit more sophisticated. By 1925, and this is a photograph from a fighting strengths comparison document that was issued that year, we have shifted from just a time-based concept of life to now life is expressed in penetrative 14-inch hits. 14-inch makes sense because the 14-inch gun was the predominant armament of the U.S. Navy's battleships. It did have ships with 16-inch guns and 12-inch guns as well, but 14-inch was the number that they chose. And then, how many of these penetrate? That is, how many of them can go through the armor of that ship and then detonate inside the vitals. So for example, battleship Nevada, which is the blue, because blue is the U.S. Navy, BB-36 here on the right side, the life of Nevada was considered to be 14 or 15.5. And then if we go to the other end of the line, BB-48, that is West Virginia. West Virginia's life was considered to be 18.6. And what you see here is an arrangement of the most modern U.S. battleships. We have 11 of them, right? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12, sorry, miscounted, against 10 of the essentially the battle line that they were anticipating on the Japanese. Orange represents Japan. And so on Japan's side, you have their 4 battle cruisers, the Congo class, and then 6 battleships, the Mutsu class, Fuzo and Yamashiro, and then Ise and Haruna, or Ise and let's say Hyuga. And what's interesting to me, these all have a value of life as well. Mutsu had, BB 6 and 5 here, had a life of 19. So a little bit larger than that of West Virginia. But if you look at the battle cruisers of the Japanese, they're rated relatively low, just 11.6 in terms of life. And you can see here, they have mapped all this out at different ranges. So at 20,000 yards and at 17,000 yards, these are ranges at which all the ships can fire at one another. But because there are more blue or US ships than there are orange Japanese, then you see this interesting fire distribution. You have some double concentrations on the US side, and you have some split fire on the Japanese side. And you can see the relative fighting strengths that get mapped out here. It's 4.34 to 1 at 20,000 yards. So the US ships have a slightly higher advantage than they do at 17,000 yards, where it's 3.29. Because of the ability of the guns to penetrate at those ranges. And these kinds of analyses begin to inform how U.S. Navy officers think about how best to fight with their battleships. That is less obvious here because these are ranges at which all the ships can fire. But when you start looking at more distant ranges, you start to see how some of this can shift. So, for example, at much longer ranges, 33,000 to 27,000 yards, there's only a limited number of ships that can shoot. Essentially, the big five on the U.S. side. So that's the Maryland and California classes, and then just the two 16-inch gun battleships on the Japanese side. So this is clearly a range band at which the United States is at an advantage. But if you lower the range a little bit, between 27,000 and 23,000, well, here the Japanese have a significant advantage because still the only U.S. ships that can fire are the big five. But the entirety of the Japanese battle line is within range. And these older U.S. ships, from Nevada on up through the New Mexico class, their gun elevation was such that they could not reach these ranges. They could not fire beyond around 23 or 22,000 yards. And so what emerges based on this analysis is a sense of range bands, distances at which the fleet might need to adjust its behavior or tactics might need to shift to account for the fact that, particularly in this, what was known as the long range band, the Japanese would be significantly superior. This more distant was called extreme. And then there was medium range between 21 or 22,000 yards and about 17. And then there was close range, which is 17,000 yards or less. And so you begin to get tactics that reflect this kind of war game analysis. Now, as we go further into the 1930s, we still have the concept of life. We still have the concept of 14-inch penetrative hits, but you start to see some very interesting visualizations to express fighting strength. Excuse me. This is one that I thought was quite interesting and wanted to share with you, because here you can see blue and orange again. So the United States and Japan again, but now we're down to 11 battleships. The Japanese are down to 9 because they've taken one of their battle cruisers and demilitarized it under the auspices of the London Treaty of 1930. But the size of the square shows the relative fighting strength of these different types, right? So that the capital ships or battle line, BL, on the left-hand side, US is bigger, and you can compare the numbers, 12,000 to 9,000. Here, for cruisers of various types, heavy and light, CA and CL, the Japanese square is bigger, so they have more capability here, roughly evenly matched as far as destroyers, and again roughly evenly matched as far as aircraft carriers, or although the Japanese have more and greater life, but not greater fighting strength. And so these helped U.S. Navy officers to think about, where do we have superiority? What are the elements of the fleet? What are the platforms that we have where we might be able to seek an advantage? Because one of the emphases at this point was, we're not sure exactly what shape a naval battle is going to take, but we need to be able to leverage whatever factors of strength that we have available at the time in order to seize maximum advantage. And so through analyses like this that were informed by the maneuver rules and the thought that went behind them, Navy officers could begin to think about where they might have an advantage over the presumed opponent, the Imperial Japanese Navy. And you also see things like this. Now here we've got a different analysis of range, because by this time, most of the U.S. battleships have been modernized or modified so that they can shoot to these longer ranges. And so this line above, this is sort of the damage that U.S. battleships can inflict on a Japanese opponent, and the dashed line below it is the opposite, the damage that the Japanese can inflict on the U.S. battleships. And you see some threading of these lines, because each of these numbers, if you can see the degree symbol above them, they indicate the target angle, because as you close the range, more shells will strike the vertical armor, the belt armor, and their target angle becomes very influential in terms of whether or not a hit might penetrate. And so the ability to damage a ship is to some degree influenced by the bearing that is showing you, whether it's broadside on or not. But here you can see there are of course significantly increasing percentage damage as the range goes down, and the advantage that the Japanese had in the long range band has been somewhat mitigated. But there's an assumption that, well, the U.S. battle line, because of its size and its strength, see if we go back here, 11 battleships to 9, and our battleships are can withstand more fire than the battlecruisers of the Japanese. Well, the slope of the U.S. line or the height of the U.S. line is greater at any of these range bands than it is for the Japanese. But so these also begin to inform, particularly if we think about target angles and how to maneuver ships, how U.S. Navy officers might fight, what kind of tactics they might employ. And you're right. I'm seeing Tom entering in the chat there. This doesn't take into account the lucky hit. Right. None of this does. This is all sort of like based on these gradual degradations. Like I said, not a boom, one penetrative hit gets to a magazine or some other area of vital importance, and all of a sudden that ship is either destroyed or its combat power is significantly degraded very, very quickly. And that is a criticism of these kinds of rules, but we have to remember they're being used to help officers think about these broad concepts, the principles. And so I think they should be evaluated less for, are they historically accurate, or do they predict combat well? And more along the lines of, do they train naval officers well? Does it familiarize them with some of the challenges that they're going to face? And we can talk more about that. Now, as I get into the interwar period, we need to talk about a few structural changes which are important to introduce the learning dynamics. One of those is the introduction of the General Board. So John Davis Long, Secretary of the Navy in the Spanish-American War, recognized that he lacked the expertise to be able to handle and manage the Navy in that war. And so he established an advisory board to assist him. These were senior naval officers, and he did not give any command authority to them. He just asked them, okay, I need your expertise. I want you to advise me. I will be the one with the authority and the accountability, but I need to draw on your knowledge. And he felt like this worked very well, and he used it to mitigate a drive that was underway to try to introduce something into the U.S. Navy, into the structure of the Navy Department, akin to the general staff that the Prussian Army had introduced. There were U.S. naval officers like Henry Clay Taylor, like Bradley Fisk, who were interested in such a thing. But Long and others like him were worried that this would undermine civilian authority in the way that it is enshrined in the U.S. system. And so Long felt, I can replicate what I did during the Spanish-American War. I can establish a general board. They will be advisory. And so I will be able, and future Navy secretaries will be able to draw on the expertise of senior naval officers without threatening civilian authority. And that's what the General Board did. And it began to get very involved in thinking about ship design and force structure, making sure that there was a fairly effective interplay between long-term planning within the U.S. Navy, concepts of how a war might be fought, and also how that was leading into the shape that the Navy was taking in terms of force design and ship design. John Kuhn has done some very good work on the General Board. He's got a book, America's First General Staff, which looks at this period and some of the good things that the General Board did. Also, we get the Chief of Naval Operations. This is in 1915. So the General Board did not satisfy some of the agitators within the Navy, particularly Bradley Fisk, and he felt that there should be some authority within the Navy Department, particularly a naval officer who could plan and prepare for war more effectively and was empowered to do so. And so he agitated with allies that he had in Congress and got language, along with other officers who were sympathetic to this cause, language into the 1915 Naval Appropriations Bill, calling for a chief of naval operations. The Secretary of the Navy at the time, Josephus Daniels, opposed the idea, but he wasn't able to get it out of the bill. However, he was able to work with his own sympathizers in Congress to sort of neuter, to a certain degree, the new role and its responsibilities. And Daniels also reached fairly far down the list of U.S. naval officers and picked William S. Benson, who he felt would be compliant and not threaten his authority as Secretary of Navy. Now, once Benson was in the role, Daniels realized the advantage that a chief of naval operations could present. He saw value in it, and so he worked in the following year to allow the office to have a little bit more authority in 1916, and it's been part of the U.S. structure ever since. This is important because it will feed into the work that happens in the interwar period. We also get the Washington Treaty. I had mentioned N square laws. Those feed into the ratios that are agreed to at Washington. Right, so the 5 and the 3, I wasn't picking those numbers out of the air. As I'm sure many of you know, this is the ratio that gets enshrined within the treaty system. The United States is allowed, 5 battleships to 5 for Great Britain's Royal Navy to 3 for the Imperial Japanese Navy. So you end up with this 5-5-3 ratio, which is informed not only by the analysis of the wargaming, but also of the way in which the United States Navy anticipates that a war in the Pacific might unfold. The United States is anticipating that their battle line will steam across the Pacific and fight the Japanese. And that, roughly speaking, there were theories that existed at this time that for every 1,000 miles of steaming, a force would lose about 10% of its strength. And so on its way across the Pacific, the U.S. Navy is going to lose some degree of its strength. And there was hope that the 5-3, which we could expand to 10-6, would allow the U.S. Navy to fight with a 7-6 ratio when it finally came to confront the Imperial Japanese Navy, and that superiority would be enough to, if not guarantee, then increase the probability of victory. The Japanese, of course, are doing more or less exactly the same analyses, and which is one of the reasons why they fought for a 10-7 ratio rather than the 10-6 or 5-3. But the Washington Treaty is in place. And so now we get to developments in the interwar period. So the second chief of naval operations, Robert Kuntz, this is a picture there, introduces something that he calls the planning cycle. This is an annual cycle because new recruits come into the Navy every year. And so they are familiarized with their ship. Each ship practices, gets the recruits up to speed. Then ships begin to practice in squadrons and formations and so on, exercises of increasing sophistication until we can have a large major exercise at the end of the year, a fleet problem. And this planning cycle ties together war planning in the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations, or OPNAV. It ties together analysis and wargaming at the Naval War College, and then these large fleet exercises, which are conducted by the Fleet Command. And all of this fosters a process of continual improvement because the results of the war planning help identify potential operational problems that are going to be encountered in a potential war or in an anticipated war in the Pacific. The Naval War College can analyze some of these and develop some sense of what might happen, but some of the more challenging ones, the ones that need some kind of like experimentation or exploration actually at sea, get fed into and seed the fleet problems. And the results of the fleet problems feed back into war planning, feed back into the Naval War College, help refine wargaming practices and procedures. So what you get is this harmonious loop. Now, remember, the way that doctrine is being developed is there's this insistence that it's going to happen at lower levels. So it will be variable and it will be contextually sensitive. But what that means is that these officers who are responsible for ensuring that their formations have some sense of doctrine are going to try out different stuff. So there will be different ways to solve similar problems, and those different ways will be tested through the mock combat of the fleet problems, because the fleet problems are contested exercises. They're not just let's go to sea and steam around. It's we're going to divide the fleet up into two halves or maybe even more, and we're going to give each half a mission. So we're going to have practice at writing plans and orders. We're going to have practice or test the ability of these subordinate commands to develop doctrine. And we're going to see how some of these new technologies at the same time can best be integrated into the fleet. Now, I know that there are theories that, with wargaming, you should be very deliberate about, what is the outcome that we're trying to achieve? Let's structure the game the right way. Let's make sure that we can get that outcome. What's happening in the U.S. Navy in this time is a bit messier. So there are criticisms we can make. Some of these rules are simplistic. Some of the habits that get formed are not necessarily as effective as they might otherwise have been once it comes time to actually test them in real combat. But you do get to see this dynamic of innovative concepts and ideas, and it happens in several different areas. The most famous area is, of course, with naval aviation, because in the late 1920s, you get the large carriers, Lexington and Saratoga, they join the fleet. There has been some practice with the prototype Langley already, so there's a sense of how to do air operations. But what the Navy starts to learn through this kind of experimentation in fleet problems is, you can have carrier task forces. Carriers can operate independently. Carriers have this ability to strike at a distance. And that helps the U.S. Navy work out how, a theory behind carrier tactics and how aircraft carriers could be used. It also gives them a strong sense of the vulnerability of aircraft carriers. And so what you see a lot in the fleet problems of the 1930s, when these carriers and the others join the fleet, is an attempt to seek out the enemy carriers and knock out their flight decks as early as possible, because that gives you aerial domination over the potential battlefield. And that leads to a particular type of plane that can scout while also simultaneously carrying a bomb load. And the most famous representation of this concept, of this tactic made real, is of course the Douglas Dauntless, the SBD, pictured here. Wartime fame, right? These are the planes that deliver the coup de grace to the Japanese carriers at Midway. Now, on those missions, they're on very deliberate strike missions, but there are also examples from the war where they're scouting with a bomb load and they seek to attack right away, report the presence of the enemy and then use the bomb, try to inflict damage immediately. Now, many other authors have written about this innovation with regard to carrier tactics. But one of the things that my writing and research has shown is that this is true for fleet tactics also. Not just the carriers, but other things, particularly how are we going to fight a large fleet battle? How will we handle the battle line? In the diagrams from the Fighting Strength Comparison book in 1925, I showed how there are a concept of range bands. And so what you get in the 1920s is theorizing about, well, how do we make sure that if we're fighting fleet, we can issue the appropriate orders at the right time so that we can maximize the advantage that we have in the long and or the extreme and the medium range band, and mitigate the disadvantage that the fleet has in the long range band, because that's where all the Japanese battleships can fight, shoot, and only a small percentage of the US battleships can. And they wrestle with this challenge. They explored it in the fleet problems, and what you see in 1930 is a new tentative manual that introduces a vocabulary, a short series of coded letters and numbers for battle plans. And it's like a playbook. I think one of the best analogies for it is it's similar to a quarterback who has a series of plays in his head or on his forearm. And so based on the circumstances of the moment, that quarterback, or in the US Navy's case, that fleet commander, is going to call a particular play. And he doesn't explain the whole thing. He doesn't tell each receiver what route to run or the offensive line how to block. Instead, he just says, this is the play. And there is a coded series of words, in the quarterback's case, letters and numbers, in the US Navy's case, that is a pointer to how each of those subsets of the organization, the football team or the US fleet should handle themselves. And this book is quite interesting because it deals with these different range bands, and each of them has assumptions. In certain plans will by default, the light forces, that is the cruisers and destroyers at either end of the US line, should attack. They should act offensively. They should try to mitigate the potential risk to the battleships so that they could cross a disadvantageous range band relatively quickly. At other ones, the light forces should hold back and act defensively, anticipate a Japanese or an enemy attack, and make ready to fight it off. And so you begin to see how the analysis in the wargaming behind it integrates with these fleet tactics. So this document was issued in 1930, is tested in the fleet problems of that year, and the feedback is very positive. It is revolutionary for some of the officers in terms of how they describe it, in terms of being able to coordinate the fleet and handle it in battle. Because not only can you adopt a particular stance at the start of the battle, because these messages are relatively quick to transmit, you can change the stance of the fleet dynamically as the battle unfolds. It's codified in an official manual in 1934, which is still official and then reissued with some revisions in the Second World War. And so this concept is something that survives for a good number of years. The other thing that gets more sophisticated through this process also has to do with surface combat is the night search and attack. This is what the US Navy called it. Now, this goes back to Sims and his work in the torpedo flotilla. It's very much as you would expect. The night search and attack is we're going to bring destroyers or torpedo-armed ships together. They're going to search for an enemy and then attack at night. And early in the interwar period, it works very much the way that Sims and his captains trialed it or developed it. That is, the search and the attack is stealthy. Destroyers, because they are not very good gun platforms at this time, rely on torpedoes to use their torpedoes because they're relatively short range. They have to close. And the best way to do that is to approach in a stealthy manner. And the screening formations that the US Navy has at this time are relatively unsophisticated, so this is possible. It's possible to penetrate a screen at night, unseen, fire torpedoes, and you may not get away, but at least you can make an attack. As the screening formations get more sophisticated, this becomes much more difficult. This starts to happen in the 1930s. And you start to see the introductions of destroyers like this one, where you've got real turrets and you've got director firing. So they are much more capable gun platforms. Many of these guns are not just good at fighting against surface targets, but they're also capable of dual purpose. They can shoot at airplanes. And so because it becomes harder to penetrate the screen, and because the destroyers are more capable as gun platforms, one of the things that starts to happen is that the night search and attack shifts from a stealthy attack, concealed penetration of a potential enemy formation, to one where destroyer captains become accustomed to fighting their way through a screen using their guns. And then once they have made it into the formation, they can use their torpedoes. So guns first, torpedoes second becomes a standard pattern in US night search and attack during this time. And we can see the negative consequences of that with some of the fighting in late 1942, particularly in the Solomons. Another thing that happens in this interwar period is you see a shift. So Edward Miller in War Plan Orange, his examination of US Navy war planning for a conflict with Japan, has coined two different camps, strategic theories, essentially, for how to fight in the Pacific: thrusters and cautionaries. Thrusters were those who wanted to move rapidly across the Pacific to ensure that the Philippines could be relieved. And then, what as that's happening, or immediately beforehand, or perhaps immediately afterward, the Japanese will seek a fleet action, which the U.S. Navy can win, and that will, if not win the war, at least create the conditions for an ultimate victory. Cautionaries believe that dashing across the Pacific is too dangerous, it's risky, we need to be more methodical, capture bases along the way that can sustain the fleet, that can ensure that not only can a fleet battle be won, but also any ships that are damaged in that fighting can be repaired and brought back into service in an effective manner. As Norman Friedman has explained in his book, Planning a Future War, in 1934, the Naval War College conducts one of these strategic games that examines this question. And what it shows is that although the thruster approach, moving quickly across the Pacific to relieve the Philippines, could work, what was likely to happen is that the United States Navy would win the major fleet action, the Japanese would be defeated. However, the Japanese would be left dominant in the Western Pacific because they could take their damaged ships and they could bring them back to Japan or other bases, repair them, refit them, make them ready to fight again. Most of the US ships would be stuck if they were damaged, especially at some forward position, perhaps in the southern Philippines. And there it would be too difficult to ensure that they could be repaired or brought back into service fast enough to contest what was likely to be the next wave of Japanese capability. And so that gaming, influenced by some of the work and fleet problems and other things, leads to this assumption that moving rapidly across the Pacific is untenable. There will have to be a methodical advance, and that means there will have to be an ability to occupy and to seize bases as we go. So now we will have to plan for amphibious assault. The Marines become not just a garrison force that will ensure that naval bases, once captured, can be defended. They also now have to become an amphibious assault force that can storm the atolls of the Central Pacific in the face of Japanese resistance. So to wrap up, I know I've been at this a little bit, but I'm trying to give you all detail and some things to chew on. Now, we see the benefits of a lot of this work. We see the learning capabilities, not just in the interwar period, but in terms of how the United States and the Navy fight the Second World War. So one of the things that I emphasized was how naval officers in this interwar period, through the fleet problems and through the strategic exercises at the Naval War College, also tactical problems, they're taught to think about what are the factors of strength that can be brought to bear. How can we fight a potential opponent? And that flexibility is valuable. And we see the value of that in the immediate aftermath to Pearl Harbor, because what the Japanese have intended is essentially the logical extension of their decisive battle concept. If we need to win a decisive battle that not only inflicts material damage on the opponent, the United States, but also convinces them that the war in the Pacific is not worth fighting, well, then why don't we do that at the outset? Why don't you do that at the beginning? Attack Pearl Harbor, shatter the battle line. Battle line is the heart of the Pacific Fleet. If we can destroy the battle line, that may convince the US Navy and the American people that the peoples of Asia are not worth fighting for. And they try it. But the United States Navy pivots very quickly because, okay, yes, we have lost one factor of strength. Well, we still have some that remain. The aircraft carriers remain. And so the Pacific Fleet pivots to this very, very quickly, right? Admiral Nimitz, Admiral Halsey, Fletcher, and others start using carrier task forces to begin to try to probe Japanese capabilities, to distract them from the southward advance, and ultimately to form an ambush at the Battle of Midway. And this occurs in large part because of this attitude of, we'll use whatever forces we have available. What remains available is the aircraft carriers. During the war, the learning dynamic that was developed and refined in the interwar period remains. Except now the way in which the US Navy learns, the feedback loop, the mechanism by which it assesses the viability of tactics and doctrine and the like shifts. And because in the interwar period, it's these fleet exercises and other competitions. You know, there are gunnery competitions, there are torpedo firing competitions, and so on. All of this is designed to refine the capabilities of ships, officers, sailors, and the like. Now, the exercises still exist, but really the feedback loop, the arbiter of whether or not your tactics are any good, is combat against the enemy, particularly against the Japanese. But the dynamic still holds, this ability to have some variability, so that different doctrines are going to be developed by different formations. They're going to test different theories and different ideas, and the mechanism that is going to assess their capabilities are the Pacific Fleet under Nimitz and his staff, and then the type commands that are immediately underneath him. And so they'll review action reports, and this is why standardized formats for action reports that were consistently filled out by various ships and various commands were so important, because they allow a sense of what's working, what's not working, what proved effective in combat. And we'll take what proved effective in combat and we'll feed that back in and use that as the basis for future concepts in terms of tactics, doctrine, and the like. And this leads to learning during wartime and a refinement of tactics and doctrine. So there's this continuous evolution that you can see through the war. Some of the dynamics in terms of how it happens and where it gets promulgated and shared are different than what we might see before the war. One of the things or the points that I make in the book, Learning War, is you can see different cycles of learning. There's learning that happens inside the combat theater itself, you know, where officers will come back to an anchorage like Tulagi, say, and they will talk about their experiences. And so knowledge is shared, learning happens that way. Then you will get learning happening at the Pacific Fleet level and with its type commands. That is not as rapid, but it is still a faster cycle than what you see at the highest of levels, which is learning at the US Navy's level. Some of you are probably familiar with the battle experience reports that came out of the Commander-in-Chief's headquarters, Admiral Ernest King. These are also useful, but they come out usually about a year or so after the combat that actually occurred. And what you can see is a lot of the learning that has happened in the theater is beyond or in advance of what is happening at the US Navy level. But you still see learning across the board. And all this, point that I make within Learning War and a point that I make in my more recent book about Admiral Nimitz and his command, is that this learning and the ability to assess these combat lessons helps impose a way of fighting onto the Japanese that is more advantageous for the United States and its allies. And that hastens the end of the war. It accelerates the accomplishment of victory. So I've said a good deal, but that is the end of the slide deck. And I'm sure there are questions. I see a number of things in the chat. I wasn't keeping up with them as I went, so I apologize for that if anyone was looking at it. So happy to start going through there, or if people want to start coming off mute and asking questions. I'm not sure.
So I've actually picked out most of the questions that were not answered, and I've got them kind of compiled here. So I'll just read them out so that for the people watching on YouTube later, they can actually see what's going on. We've got one from Tom, who asks, how did naval wargamers deal with the tension between playability and accessibility versus realism when dealing with officers who are practitioners and not gamers?
Yeah, I think what you see, particularly in the games or the rules for the games that govern exercises at sea, is an emphasis on sort of speed and playability, not realism. They want it to be real enough. If you look at how the Navy was doing this, real enough to allow identification of winners and losers, real enough to allow us to determine which tactics are likely to be more effective than others, but not a high level of accuracy or detail. You can see that with sort of the gradual degradation of fighting capability, and you can see that also with how some of these things are fairly simplistic in terms of the rule structure.
We have another question from Theodore who asks, to what degree did the Naval War College have knowledge of or take into account Japanese doctrinal evolution in their war games?
There is some window into what the Japanese are doing because there's an ability for the U.S. Navy to listen in on fleet exercises that the Japanese are conducting. We know all very well of the ability that the U.S. Navy gained in concert with its allies to break Japanese Navy codes in the Second World War. But that goes back a long way. And I remember looking through some records. It was from an exercise in 1934 that the Japanese fleet conducted, and the Asiatic fleet was listening in on it, created an accurate order of battle based on their ability to read the Japanese messages and the Japanese codes and so on. But what you see a lot of is mirror imaging. So yes, they have some sense of what the Japanese are going to be able to do, but the assumption is and I think this is probably most visible in terms of capabilities of aircraft and also capabilities of Japanese torpedoes, that the Japanese are going to have capabilities broadly similar to those of the U.S. Navy. So the fact that the Japanese have an oxygen-powered torpedo that can reach as far as a battleship shell, that was not considered. No, this is not something that was believed even well into the Second World War. The range that Japanese planes display, both their land-based planes, like the Mitsubishi land attack plane, the Betty, and also their carrier aircraft. That was unanticipated. The ability of the Japanese to concentrate all, or more or less all, of their carrier air power into the first air fleet, also unanticipated. So you can they have some window of what the Japanese are going to do, but it's very much filtered or informed by assumptions or the patterns of belief that the U.S. Navy officers already hold. So if you were going to score the U.S. Navy on its red teaming ability in this period, I think you'd have to score them pretty low.
We have a few more questions. So we got one from David Redpath who asks, was the playbook idea essentially a battle drill? And were they originally developed well before this in World War One? He notes that there was something similar with the Grand and High fleets during World War One, but due to a lack of radio tech, it usually got messed up more often than not.
Battle drum, is that what you said? Like drum, like in terms of like cadence and that
No, a battle drill. Battle
oh,
drill.
battle drill.
Apologies.
Okay. Um, no, I don't think it's just a battle drill. It's intended to be this way in which to sort of dynamically adjust the stance of the fleet based on what's happening in the circumstances of the combat. And so they felt like it was a new capability. Obviously, you could do these same kinds of things using radio communication beforehand, but without the patterns, the way to take the pointer, the short signal of letters and numbers, and translate that into this page or this specific plan in the book. It's difficult to convey that much information that succinctly. It's interesting that the questioner has brought up the Grand Fleet battle orders, or alluded to what the Grand Fleet and the High Seas Fleet were doing in World War One. One of the things that I didn't mention, but I think that is relevant to this, is by working with the Grand Fleet, the U.S. Navy gained some familiarity with how the Royal Navy was approaching these kinds of concepts. And there was, and you can see it in records post World War One, there was a strong sense that the Grand Fleet battle orders as constructed and as employed in 1918 were too restrictive for the U.S. Navy's taste. They felt like they would undermine the initiative of subordinate officers. And this resonates to a certain degree with some of the criticisms that Andrew Gordon made in his book, The Rules of the Game. And it's interesting that, so much separation in time, and yet there is this similarity. So one of the things that the U.S. Navy was stressing at the time was, we cannot be that prescriptive. We have to preserve greater flexibility and greater room for individual initiative within the fleet. And the specific approach to developing doctrine was a way to try to do that, right? So we'll give these subordinate commands an ability to exercise their initiative, to try to leverage creativity. We'll encourage that. You, subordinate, destroyer division commander, you have to figure out, what is your doctrine? How are you going to fight your ships? I'm not going to control that. I may tell you when you have to take your ships, toward the horizon to go after an opposing battle line. But once you start off, that's your bailiwick, because the what the U.S. Navy saw in this was if we do that, if we give some more freedom and flexibility in that regard, then we hope those officers will respond. If we're too prescriptive, if we tell them too much what to do, then we worry that we'll curtail their creativity. And you see this in several places in the aftermath of this exposure to the Royal Navy and to the Grand Fleet. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that there are Royal Navy officers who react similarly, and we can see how the conduct of the Royal Navy shifted as in the interwar period, and it becomes more aggressive than it was, say, in World War One, in part in reaction to their experiences of that conflict in World War Two.
We have one more question from David, who asks, how did the Naval War College War Games approach the ideas of, vision, search, detection, those types of concepts, which are so important for gunnery?
Yeah, there are a number of things that gunnery. Sorry, I'm just consulting a paper that I had here that might give me some better insight on exactly how to answer this question. It's from the maneuver rules of 1941. Yeah, even here they've got modifiers, which I think are really interesting for like gases. So like if you're firing through the exhaust gases of a ship that is ahead of you in line or upwind for you, that's gonna have an impact. If the sun is in a certain position and it's impacting the glare, then that's going to have an impact. If your target is silhouetted, well, that's positive. So there are lots of details that they got into in terms of how to run these more sophisticated games that were being run at the Naval War College. And one of the things that I've always wanted to do is get a thorough copy of the rules and actually try a game with those. I haven't done it. I think there may be some people out there who have. Well, certainly people at the War College who have, because I know a couple of years ago they sort of refought the Battle of Jutland with the old maneuver rules. But I think that would be really, really interesting. Here's some other ones that talk about ship spray and the impact that might have, concentration firing. So if you get two ships firing at the same target, there's a little bit of degradation. I think they would allow up to 3, but with more significant degradation. And if I remember right, after 4, 4 isn't really allowed. There's no advantage. All those different things. As far as visibility, though, or being able to see and shoot for the longer ranges, there's an emphasis, and this is one of the reasons why initially carriers were so important, on having to use aerial spotting. Right, you can only shoot so far, not to the range of the farthest guns, if you have to rely on spotting from the top of the ship, because at a certain point the hull, the waterline of the target disappears over the horizon. And so to really be accurate with your shooting, to assess, where is the shell landing relative to the target, you need some other form of visibility, some other view into the target. And aerial spotting was provided by that. So that's taken care of in the rules too. If you don't have aerial spotting, well, you can't shoot effectively over a certain distance, and so on. So if you want to use aerial spotting, you need to control the air of the battlefield, and well, you need carriers for that.
I think we've got a few more questions, but they're kind of on the same line, so I'm going to combine them in here. So, what did any other foreign navies try to copy what American wargaming looked like during this period? The questioners mentioned, the Japanese in particular gaming out the Battle of Midway, but they didn't really have umpires that were fair and impartial. Was there any lessons that the Japanese learned from American wargaming and vice versa, maybe?
I'm not entirely sure how familiar they were with it. Speaking of the Japanese specifically, I know that the British did some level of wargaming. I don't know if they adopted U.S. tactics or or U.S. techniques. Um, but I wish I knew more about Japanese wargaming. The example of the war game before the Battle of Midway is very interesting, because one of the things that I've always wondered is, what was that game actually for? Because it's easy for us from a distance to sort of criticize it and say, oh yeah, well, if you play it as a test of will this operation work? Is it feasible? Then they sort of blow that over, right? They say, oh no, the Americans won't do that. They won't behave that way. That's an unrealistic outcome. Uh, but is it, what are they trying to do with it? Is it actually a test of that, or is it more a demonstration of the feasibility? War games have different intentions, and I'm not sure what exactly their intentions were with that. And I think some of our criticism is inadequate to account for the circumstances that may have actually existed at that time. One of the things that I think is important to remember, though, is that the U.S. naval officers are using the tactical wargaming to try to understand principles and try to figure out how to apply them to context. They're using some of the strategic war games to get better at conceptualizing plans and orders and formulating how to conduct naval operations or naval warfare. And then they put sort of all those things together in the broader fleet exercises. So there's this interlocking system that creates positive feedback loops, positive both in terms of amplification, but positive also in terms of directionality, in terms of things getting better. And I know that the Japanese are certainly improving as well. You can see how their tactics are changing over the interwar period. Evans and PD covered that quite well in Kaigun, but a lot of the criticism, which again I wish I knew more about it, is because of there's this gravitational pull, for lack of a better term, this sort of strange attractor that exists around this decisive battle concept. And I don't know how much of that is due to what gets imparted into secondary sources and how much of that is a real reflection of what the Japanese were trying to do. I think sometimes what comes to someone like me who does not speak Japanese and hasn't been in their primary sources is a sort of a distorted view. They were professionals too, and they were thinking very hard about how to fight and win a war like this. And I think it's easy to get sort of caught up in assumptions about their lack of capability or inability to assess things. And I think sometimes that's unfair. Kind of a long answer. Not sure I did it justice, but
I No, that was perfect. I think with that, we're probably going to wrap it up. We are coming up on kind of the hour and a half mark.
oh
But
well. Can I answer one more question?
oh yeah, go ahead.
Because
Sure.
I just saw it here in the chat. Well, first I'll just say, Theater Cook, I agree. Yeah, nature of Japanese wargaming, major lacuna, totally. But it's the question before that from Owen Cooper. What was the problem with guns than torpedoes as a tactic? So try to do this one justice relatively quickly. But one of the criticisms that many people have leveled, if we go back, for example, to Wayne Hughes and his fleet tactics at the United States Navy, we look at the fighting in the Solomons, off Guadalcanal, late 1942. One of the criticisms is that the U.S. Navy does not take full advantage of its capabilities, particularly because a lot of the times destroyers are kept in line with cruisers. They are not set free to be able to use their torpedoes to close. And the Japanese are much more effective at using their torpedoes. Part of the reason is they have longer range torpedoes, but part of the reason also is they have retained an emphasis, and this goes back a long way. You can see it in the Russo-Japanese War on closing and being very aggressive with torpedo tactics. There are the best 1942 battle example of this is the Battle of Tasafranga, where you have a U.S. squadron that is more or less decimated by Japanese torpedo fire from their destroyers, the U.S. ships try to counter it with gunfire from cruisers, but for a variety of different reasons, one of which is the limitations of radar-directed gunfire at the time, they are not able to secure as many potential hits. And so it's not really until the midpoint of 1943 that U.S. Commanders set their own destroyers loose and are able to use increasingly sophisticated radars, the introduction of the Combat Information Center, to sort of go back to tactics from decades prior of a stealthy approach, fire torpedoes first. Once they hit, then start shooting guns, so that you can take advantage of surprise. So that is that's not really justice for that question either, but that is sort of an effective submarine or an effective submarine and improved torpedoes, as Tim says. Yes, absolutely. So great. Thank you.
All right, we're gonna stop the recording